My name is Layla. I am 29 years old. Last month, my mother raised a glass of champagne in front of 35 relatives and announced that I was writing an $80,000 check for my sister's Cape Cod wedding. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my drink. I stood up, tapped my glass against hers, and whispered a single word that made my mother go pale, and my sister burst into tears. I said fraud. My father shrank into his chair. He watched me expose them. He said nothing. The room clapped, assuming my quiet response was a joke. But that single word didn't start a war. It ended an illusion I had been financing without even knowing it. Before I take you back to that dinner, take a second to like and subscribe to Sofia Told Stories, and drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. Let me take you to the private dining room at the Seaport Grill. It smelled of roasted garlic, drawn butter, and the kind of old Boston money my mother had spent her entire adult life trying to mimic. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the dark water of Boston Harbor chopped against the docks. Inside, 35 of our relatives were on their third round of vintage champagne. My mother Barbara tapped a silver spoon against her crystal flute. The chatter in the room faded into an expectant hush. She smoothed the front of her tailored navy dress, beaming at the crowd, with the polished grace of a seasoned politician. To my beautiful daughter, Haley, Barbara projected. Her voice carried effortlessly over the low jazz playing through the ceiling speakers. She gestured toward my younger sister. Haley sat wearing a custom silk dress and a diamond ring that caught the ambient light. And to my generous daughter, Layla, my mother continued, who has so graciously agreed to write the check for this entire $80,000 Cape Cod dream. The room erupted into applause. Aunts and uncles turned in their chairs to beam at me, glasses raised in my direction. I am a corporate tax CPA. My profession requires me to remain unflappable while examining discrepancies. Panic is for people who do not have the receipts. I had the receipts. I picked up my water glass. I stood from my chair. I tapped the rim against Barbara's champagne flute, a crisp, delicate clink. Then I leaned across the linen tablecloth, lowering my voice so only the head table could hear the acoustics of my response. "Mom," I said, keeping my smile fixed for the relatives watching us. That is a beautiful sentiment, but we both know the only word for this arrangement is fraud. I pulled back and took a sip of my water. The surrounding room offered a polite, confused gasp. They assumed I was declining the financial credit with a dry, self-deprecating joke. But at the head table, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Barbara's painted smile froze. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her makeup looking like a mask painted on chalk. Next to her, Haley dropped her gaze to her lap. Her shoulders shook as she began sobbing into a linen napkin. And then there was my father, Thomas. He didn't look at me. He just shrank down into his chair, staring at his half-eaten halibut. I noticed his suit jacket hung 2 inches too loose on his frame, pooling around his shoulders. When he reached for his water, his cuff rode up. It revealed a pale tan line on his wrist where his gold retirement watch used to sit. He had worn that watch every single day for a decade. Now it was gone. Those small, quiet details were the physical symptoms of a much deeper rot. I didn't drop the word fraud at that table to be cruel. I dropped it because I had spent that very morning sitting at my kitchen island in Somerville, looking at legally binding tax documents that proved my own parents were actively stealing from me. Do you know how it feels to smile for a room full of relatives while holding the paperwork that could send your mother to federal prison? It is a very specific kind of cold. To understand the dinner, you have to understand the trail of ink that led me there. It started the previous Tuesday. I am not a private investigator. I handle my family's standard 1,040 tax returns because it saves them money. It is a simple favor I have done since I passed my licensing exams. While reviewing their Schedule A deductions, I spotted a large, unexplained interest payment to a regional bank in the Berkshire Mountains. Following the paper trail, I requested the supplemental documents from the bank portal I had access to as their preparer. What I found was a newly activated home equity line of credit. But the collateral wasn't just their house. It was legally tethered to a generation-skipping transfer trust. Our grandfather left me. That trust was designed to vest on my 30th birthday next year. It was my safety net. It was my future. I pulled the digital authorization forms. In the bottom right corner of the PDF was an IP address timestamp. I recognized the address immediately. It belonged to the router in my parents' Lexington living room. Someone had forged a hardship distribution consent form. They didn't just forge my signature. They attached a digital notary stamp claiming I was using the funds to buy into my CPA partnership. The wire transfer, however, routed straight to my parents' joint checking account. The obstacle I faced was immense. I could not simply call the bank and freeze the account. Disputing the debt triggers an automatic default investigation. That process locks the credit profile of everyone involved. Right now, my accounting firm is running a rigorous financial background check on me. I am weeks away from buying into the partnership track. A locked credit profile or an active fraud investigation attached to my name means I lose the partnership. Years of 80-hour work weeks would evaporate. So I sat at my kitchen island drinking cold coffee, realizing my parents had trapped me. If I exposed them immediately, I blew up my own career. If I said nothing, I became complicit in their financial crime. That is why I went to the engagement dinner. I needed to see them. I needed to look my mother in the eye and see if she felt any guilt. Instead, she raised a glass and tried to publicly trap me into paying for the very wedding she was already using my stolen trust fund to finance. She thought the social pressure of 35 relatives would force me to smile and nod. She thought I would protect the family image. She underestimated how much I respect a clean ledger. Sitting back down at the table, I watched my mother struggle to regain her composure. She took a sharp breath, pushing her shoulders back for the sake of her sister-in-law sitting 2 chairs down. "Layla is just being modest," Barbara announced to the table, her voice brittle and forced. I didn't correct her again. I didn't need to. The damage at the head table was done. I picked up my fork and cut a piece of my steak, eating it methodically. Haley was still crying softly into her napkin. Thomas was still staring at his fish. I knew the real fight was not going to happen in this restaurant. The real fight was going to happen in the details, in the fine print, and in the choices I had to make over the next few weeks. My parents had built an $80,000 fantasy on top of a forged document. My job was to dismantle that fantasy without destroying my own life in the process. To truly understand the weight of that dinner, you have to rewind the clock to the previous Tuesday. It was raining in Somerville. I was sitting at my kitchen island with a mug of stale coffee and 2 computer monitors glowing in the dim light of my apartment. I am not a private investigator. I am an accountant. People lie. Numbers do not. Numbers leave a trail like footprints in fresh snow. Every year, I handle my parents' standard tax returns to save them a few $100s in accounting fees. It is a quiet duty I perform out of a lingering sense of familial obligation. My father scans his W-2 forms, and my mother sends over a neat digital folder of charitable donation receipts. They think organizing a folder makes the finances transparent. That Tuesday, I was reconciling their Schedule A itemized deductions. It is tedious work. You look for mortgage interest, property taxes, and medical expenses. As I scrolled down the digital spreadsheet, my cursor stopped on line 8. There was a 6-figure interest payment logged to a regional bank located in the Berkshire Mountains. My parents live in Lexington. Their original mortgage is through a national bank headquartered in Boston. They have no property in the Berkshires. They have no business in the Berkshires. A good accountant feels a discrepancy in their stomach before their brain even processes the error. It is a subtle shift in the room temperature. I opened a new tab on my browser and logged into their banking portal using the credentials my father gave me 5 years ago. I navigated to the External Linked Accounts tab. There, sitting quietly in the ledger, was a newly activated home equity line of credit. The balance drawn was exactly $80,000. I downloaded the loan origination PDF. My eyes scanned the boilerplate legal text until I reached the section detailing the collateral. They had not just leveraged the equity in their Lexington home. The loan was cross-collateralized. It was tied directly to a generation-skipping transfer trust. The air in my apartment felt thin. That trust belonged to me. Our grandfather was a pragmatic man who ran a machine shop in Worcester. He worked with his hands, and he understood the value of a dollar. He also understood my mother. He watched Barbara spend her 20s chasing the validation of high society women in country clubs she could barely afford. When he drafted his estate, he deliberately bypassed his own daughter. He placed the remaining family money into a trust designed to vest on my 30th birthday. He told me it was my safety net. He told me it was the foundation I would need to build a quiet, independent life. I turn 30 next year. I clicked the supplemental documents attached to the loan file. A separate PDF opened on my second monitor. It was titled Hardship Distribution Consent. According to the document, I had formally requested an early withdrawal of the trust principal to cover emergency medical expenses. I stared at the screen. At the bottom of the page was my signature. It was a digital script tracing the exact loop of my cursive letters. Next to it was a digital notary stamp verifying my identity. Someone had forged my name. When you discover a betrayal of this magnitude, your brain tries to offer polite excuses. You tell yourself it is a clerical error. You tell yourself the bank merged two files by mistake. But I work in tax compliance. I know how to read the silent data hidden inside a document. I right-clicked the PDF and opened the file properties to view the metadata. Every digital signature leaves a forensic footprint indicating where and when the document was executed. I scrolled down to the origin IP address. I recognized the sequence of numbers immediately. It was the static IP address assigned to the wireless router in my parents' Lexington living room. My mother had not just taken the money. She had sat at her cherry wood dining table connected to her home network and typed my name into a fraudulent legal document. She hijacked the safety net my grandfather built for me, and she routed the funds directly into her joint checking account to pay for imported lobsters and custom floral arrangements. The logical response is to pick up the phone, call the bank, and report the fraud. You freeze the account. You let the legal system handle the rest. But life is rarely that clean. My mother knew exactly what she was doing when she chose this specific month to steal from me. I am an associate at a top-tier accounting firm in Boston. For the past 6 years, I have worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing weekends and holidays to climb the corporate ladder. Next month, the senior partners are voting on my elevation to a full equity partner. It is the defining moment of my career. Buying into a partnership track requires pristine financial standing. The firm acts as a fiduciary for multinational corporations. They cannot have a partner with compromised credit or pending litigation. Right now, the firm is conducting a rigorous financial background check on my entire profile. If I call that regional bank in the Berkshires and dispute the $80,000 debt, it triggers an automatic default investigation. The bank will immediately lock the trust and freeze the cross-collateralized assets. They will place a fraud alert on my Social Security number. When my firm runs my credit report next week, they will see an active federal financial dispute attached to my name. The senior partners do not care about family drama. They care about liability. A fraud investigation flags me as a liability. They will pause my partnership promotion. Once a promotion is paused in my industry, it is almost never offered again. I was trapped. If I reported the forgery, I blew up my own career and handed the partners a reason to pass me over. If I stayed silent to protect my background check, I became legally complicit in a federal financial crime. My mother had effectively taken my career hostage to fund my sister's wedding. I stood up from the kitchen island and walked to the window. The rain was hitting the glass in heavy rhythmic sheets. I looked out over the wet streets of Somerville. The anger sitting in my chest was cold and calculating. I realized the $80,000 wedding was not a celebration. It was a crime scene. For the first 48 hours after that Tuesday, I directed all my silent rage at Haley. I scrolled through my sister's social media feeds, viewing the endless stream of bridal content. There she was smiling outside a bridal boutique on Newbury Street. There she was holding up her diamond ring at a country club luncheon. It was easy to view her as the greedy antagonist driving our family into ruin. I convinced myself Haley was the mastermind demanding a lavish event to satisfy her own ego. I prepared to dismantle her dream piece by piece. But true conflicts rarely offer a simple villain. The anger I harbored toward my sister was about to fracture. The narrative I had built in my head regarding Haley's guilt shattered a few days later when my apartment intercom buzzed late in the evening. The person standing in the hallway was not the polished, glowing bride from the photographs. It was a woman buckling under a weight she could no longer carry. The illusion of the perfect Massachusetts wedding was hiding a generational trauma I had managed to escape, but she had absorbed entirely. And the conversation we were about to have would force me to realize that my sister was not the enemy. She was a casualty. The buzzer on my apartment wall let out a harsh, flat dial tone. I checked the video monitor expecting a late delivery driver. Instead, the grainy black and white screen showed my younger sister standing in the rain. Haley was not wearing the designer trench coat she usually paraded around the back bay. She wore a faded gray hoodie pulled tight across her chest. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. I pressed the unlock button and waited by my door. For the previous 3 days, I had fed a quiet, bitter anger directed squarely at her. It was easy to cast Haley as the villain in this financial disaster. At our recent family gatherings, she had played the role of the entitled bride with award-winning precision. She talked over our aunts to brag about her custom Vera Wang gown fittings. She spent entire dinners flashing a flawless 2-carat engagement ring under the dining room chandelier. She complained about the cost of imported peonies while I secretly knew those flowers were bought with my stolen future. I had spent hours pacing my apartment formulating the exact sentences I would use to destroy her vanity. I wanted to tear down her perfect bridal facade. But as I opened my front door and watched her step into my hallway, the anger I had carefully cultivated began to falter. Haley looked like a ghost. She was shivering. Her shoulders were hunched forward, and her hands gripped the sleeves of her hoodie so hard her knuckles were white. I stepped aside and led her into the kitchen. I handed her a towel and poured a glass of water. She sat on a bar stool and stared at the granite countertop. The silence between us stretched for several long seconds. I waited for her to complain about a late vendor or a misprinted invitation. I waited for the bridezilla routine. Instead, she took a ragged breath and looked up at me. Her eyes were bloodshot. She told me she could not do this anymore. She said she felt like she was suffocating inside a life that did not belong to her. She looked at her engagement ring and twisted it around her finger like it was a shackle. Looking at her broken expression, a memory from 10 years ago hit me with sharp, sudden clarity. We were teenagers living in our parents' Lexington home. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early April. I had just walked through the front door carrying my backpack. I heard a strange, guttural weeping coming from the kitchen. I found our mother sitting on the hardwood floor surrounded by scattered mail. She was clutching a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was a rejection letter from Harvard University addressed to Haley. My mother was not crying to comfort her daughter. She was crying for herself. I remember Barbara looking up at the ceiling, her face twisted in genuine agony, wailing about what she would tell the other women at the country club. She shrieked that we looked like failures. She said the neighbors would pity us. Haley stood in the corner of the kitchen, pressing her back against the refrigerator. She looked small and hollow. She absorbed that toxic academic pressure right into her bones. That afternoon set the trajectory for both of our lives. I saw the trap my mother was building. I deliberately chose a different path. I enrolled in a solid, respectable state school in Amherst. I paid my own rent, worked quiet internships, and built a career in accounting far away from the elite social circles my mother worshipped. I became immune to her validation. Haley never figured out how to escape. She accepted the heavy crown of the golden child. She spent her late teens and early 20s trying to buy our mother's love with prestigious labels. She attended 2 different elite universities in New England. She flunked out of both. The academic rigor was crushing, but the weight of our mother's expectations was lethal. Haley spent years covering up her perceived inadequacies with designer clothes and curated social media posts. Now sitting in my Somerville kitchen, the curated posts were gone. Haley took a sip of the water and finally confessed the truth about her engagement. Brendan is a good man, but his family represents everything our mother idolizes and everything my sister fears. They are old Boston money. They have trust funds tied to Mayflower descendants and vacation homes on Martha's Vineyard. They operate in a world of silent judgment and inherited wealth. Haley began to cry again, harder this time. She told me Brendan's mother had spent the last 6 months making passive-aggressive remarks about our family's lack of pedigree. His aunts whispered about Haley's incomplete college transcripts during afternoon teas. Haley felt like an imposter who had tricked a wealthy heir into proposing. She was drowning in anxiety, terrified that one wrong move would expose her as a fraud to her future in-laws. She looked at me with a raw, desperate vulnerability. She confessed she did not even want a Cape Cod wedding. She hated the ocean. She hated the imported lobsters and the 300-person guest list. She and Brendan had originally discussed a quiet elopement in the mountains. But Barbara had hijacked the engagement the moment the ring slipped onto Haley's finger. Our mother saw the marriage as her ultimate redemption tour. A lavish high society event was Barbara's chance to prove to the Lexington Country Club crowd that her family had finally arrived. She steamrolled Haley's wishes, demanding a spectacle that would rival the weddings of Brendan's elite cousins. Haley told me she just wanted to feel like she was enough. She wanted one day where she did not have to perform for an audience. She was letting our mother control the wedding because she thought it was the only way to earn Barbara's permanent approval. She thought a perfect wedding would finally erase the shame of that Harvard rejection letter. I stood leaning against my kitchen counter, processing her words. The narrative I had constructed earlier that week dissolved. Haley was not the architect of my financial ruin. She was just another asset my mother was leveraging to buy social status. Barbara was using my stolen trust fund to purchase an $80,000 stage, and she was forcing my sister to act out a play she hated. I walked around the island and put my hand on my sister's shoulder. I let her cry until she ran out of tears. I did not tell her about the forged documents or the stolen trust fund that night. I could not hand a drowning woman an anchor. Discovering that her dream wedding was built on a federal crime would have shattered whatever fragile sanity she had left. When Haley finally washed her face and ordered a ride back to her apartment, the dynamic between us had shifted. We were no longer rivals competing for space in a dysfunctional family. We were two women trapped in the same burning building. I locked the door after she left and walked back to my computer monitors. The glowing screens displayed the bank statements and the forged notary stamps. My instinct to protect myself was now intertwined with a fierce desire to protect my sister from the toxic cycle our mother had created. I needed a strategy to dismantle the wedding without letting Haley take the collateral damage. I opened my email to contact a lawyer I knew from my firm. But before I could type a single sentence, a new notification chimed in my inbox. It was an automated message from the regional bank in the Berkshires. The subject line contained an urgent compliance notice. My quiet, discreet inquiries into the home equity line of credit had triggered a security algorithm. The bank was initiating a formal audit on the trust account. The digital walls were closing in faster than I anticipated. The financial crisis was no longer a private family secret waiting for me to solve it. It was becoming an active corporate investigation, and my name was printed right at the top of the ledger. I stared at the subject line of the email until the letters blurred together. Urgent compliance notice. The regional bank in the Berkshire Mountains was no longer a passive ledger. It was awake. My attempts to investigate the home equity line of credit by logging into the portal and downloading documents had tripped an automated security protocol. Financial institutions employ sophisticated software designed to detect unusual behavior. A sudden flurry of downloads on a high-value trust account that had sat dormant for years was a bright red flag to their risk management department. I clicked open the message. The bank was initiating a formal audit to verify the hardship distribution. They required updated identification records, a secondary confirmation of the digital notary, and matching tax filings to prove the funds were applied to the stated medical emergency. My chest tightened until taking a normal breath felt like a chore. The situation had just morphed from a private family nightmare into a federal liability. I am not just an aggrieved daughter in this scenario. I am a licensed, certified public accountant. My signature sits at the bottom of my parents' previous tax returns listed clearly on the line designated for the paid preparer. When the bank initiates a compliance audit, they inevitably cross-reference the loan documentation with recent IRS filings to verify income and assets. The moment a banking auditor looks closely at that forged digital signature, the entire facade will crumble. The legal reality of my profession is rigid. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants mandates a strict code of professional conduct. If a bank auditor flags the transaction as fraudulent, they are legally obligated to report it to federal authorities. We are talking about wire fraud and the illegal disbursement of a generation-skipping trust. If I attempt to shield my parents to protect them from prosecution, I cross a very clear ethical line. I become a co-conspirator. The state accounting board will revoke my CPA license. My career will end before my 30th birthday. But the alternative felt like swallowing glass. If I step forward and proactively report the forgery to the bank, I am the one holding the match. I would be signing the sworn statement that sends my own mother and father into a federal courtroom. I would be the architect of their ruin. I spent my entire 20s building my professional credentials. While my sister chased the approval of high society matrons, I sat in fluorescent-lit libraries studying tax law and ethical compliance. I passed all 4 sections of the uniform CPA examination on the first try. That license is not just a piece of paper. It represents my independence. It is the armor I built to survive the suffocating expectations of a mother who valued pedigree over character. Losing my license meant losing the only identity I actually chose for myself. My parents had effectively taken my career hostage to fund my sister's wedding. The next morning, I had to drive out to a client site in Worcester. I barely slept. I drank 3 cups of black coffee and walked out into a brutal New England sleet storm. The Massachusetts Turnpike was a gray, slick expanse of asphalt. I gripped the steering wheel of my sedan, navigating the heavy morning traffic while icy rain pelted the windshield. The rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers sounded like a ticking clock. The bank had given a 10-day window to provide the requested audit compliance documents. 10 days to decide if I should destroy my hard-earned career or destroy my family. The tension I had carried since the engagement dinner finally breached its container. I could not maintain the calm, calculating persona I used to navigate corporate boardrooms. The emotional weight of the betrayal collided with the stark terror of losing my livelihood. I engaged my turn signal and steered the car onto the gravel shoulder of the highway just past the toll plaza. I shifted the transmission into park and let go of the steering wheel. I could barely breathe. A raw, jagged sound ripped out of my throat. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. I hit the steering wheel with the heel of my hands over and over. I screamed into the empty car until my vocal cords ached and my vision went blurry with tears. I was so angry at my mother for putting me in this impossible position. I was furious at my father for standing by and letting her do it. But beneath the anger was a profound, agonizing grief. I realized my parents viewed me as collateral damage. They weighed my future against a catered reception on Cape Cod and decided the reception was more important. I pounded my fists against the dashboard, weeping for the family I thought I had. I mourned the realization that my loyalty to them was a one-way street. It was an ugly, messy breakdown. My makeup smeared across my face, and my hands shook uncontrollable. There was no clever accounting trick to balance this equation. I was just a daughter sitting on the side of a frozen highway, realizing she had to amputate her own family to survive. I stayed on the shoulder of the turnpike for 20 minutes, watching the commercial trucks roar past in showers of gray slush. The cold air seeping through the windows eventually chilled my skin. Slowly, the chaotic storm of panic began to subside. I turned on the heater and pressed my cold hands against the vents to steady the trembling. I found a tissue in the glove compartment and wiped my face. The raw, emotional purge left behind a cold, hard clarity. I could not run from this. I could not hide behind legal extensions or ignore the bank notices, hoping the problem would vanish. I had to face the source of the rot. I shifted the car back into drive and merged onto the highway. I knew my mother would not surrender easily. She was too heavily invested in the illusion of this wedding. She knew the bank notices would be arriving in her own mail very soon. She would try to corner me before the audit finalized. She needed me to fall in line and sign whatever supplementary documents the bank demanded to make the investigation disappear. I checked my mental calendar when I reached the client parking lot. In 2 days, Barbara was hosting an extravagant bridal shower for Haley in Lexington. It would be a house full of wealthy neighbors, imported champagne, and suffocating social pressure. It was the perfect stage for my mother to ambush me. She thought she could use guilt to force my compliance. She thought I would fold under the weight of family loyalty just to avoid causing a scene in front of her country club friends. She relied on my quiet nature, assuming I would protect her reputation at the expense of my own life. She was about to find out what happens when you push an accountant past the point of return. The math was no longer working in her favor, and I was preparing to balance the ledger. 2 days later, I pulled my sedan onto the gravel driveway of my childhood home in Lexington. Valets in crisp white shirts were parking luxury SUVs along the manicured lawn. A hired string quartet played classical music on the back patio. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and catered appetizers. It was a flawless presentation of New England prosperity. It was also a lie. I walked through the heavy oak front door and handed my coat to a hired attendant. In the living room, Brendan's relatives mingled with my mother's country club acquaintances. Waitstaff circulated with silver trays holding crystal champagne flutes. Standing near the fireplace, Barbara held court. She wore a pastel silk dress and laughed at a joke told by Brendan's aunt. From a distance, she looked like the epitome of generational wealth. I kept to the perimeter of the room, sipping sparkling water and watching the performance. I knew why I was here. This was not a celebration. This was a hostage negotiation. Barbara knew the bank audit notices were arriving. She knew I had a 10-day window to submit compliance documents. She invited me into a house full of witnesses because she thought the social pressure would break my resolve. After 30 minutes, Barbara excused herself from the wealthy matriarchs. She caught my attention across the room and gave a quick, subtle nod toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. I set my glass down and followed her. We bypassed the main kitchen where the catering team was busy preparing finger sandwiches. Barbara pulled me into the narrow butler's pantry and firmly shut the door. The ambient noise of the string quartet muffled behind the heavy wood. The flawless hostess facade vanished the instant the latch clicked. Barbara dropped her shoulders. The vibrant energy drained from her posture, leaving her looking older and fragile. Her hands trembled as she reached into a hidden pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She flattened the document on the marble counter between us. It was a retroactive consent form. The bank required my physical signature to validate the forged digital authorization. Signing it would legitimize the theft. It would make the early trust withdrawal legal, clearing the audit and protecting my CPA license. It would also mean I willingly surrendered my $80,000 safety net. "Sign it," Barbara whispered. Her voice was jagged and raw. "Please, Layla, just sign it, and I swear we will pay you back." I looked at the paper and then at my mother. I asked her why she did it. I demanded to know why she chose to steal my future instead of simply scaling back the wedding. Barbara gripped the edge of the marble counter. Her knuckles turned white. She looked up at the ceiling, blinking rapidly to stop the tears from ruining her makeup. "Your father lost his pension," she said. The words came out like broken glass. I froze. Thomas had worked as an executive for a regional logistics firm for 25 years. He was the breadwinner who financed the Lexington house and the country club dues. 3 years ago, the firm went bankrupt. Barbara continued, her voice trembling. The executive retirement fund evaporated. The severance ran out in 6 months. Thomas has not been able to find another executive role since. No one wants to hire a 60-year-old man in a declining industry. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together. The gold retirement watch missing from his wrist at the engagement dinner. He had pawned it, the suit hanging loose on his frame. He had lost 20 pounds from the chronic stress of unemployment. They had hidden their financial ruin out of pure debilitating shame. They kept paying the country club dues on credit just to maintain the illusion of success. "We borrowed the trust money to keep the family afloat," Barbara pleaded. She stepped closer to me. The panic in her eyes was genuine. "We were drowning, Layla. We maxed out the credit cards. We took out a second mortgage. I thought Thomas would secure a new position by now. I thought we could replace the funds before you ever found out." I stared at her. "But you did not use the money to pay the mortgage," I said. "You used it to book a Cape Cod wedding." Barbara let out a desperate, choked sob. "You do not understand how these people operate," she insisted, referring to Brendan's family. "If Haley brings a cheap backyard wedding to that family, they will look down on her forever. They value pedigree. They value status. If they find out we are broke, they will treat your sister like a charity case. This wedding is her armor. Once she marries Brendan, she is safe. She will have a financial security net Thomas and I can no longer provide. If this wedding falls apart, Haley loses her future." I stood in the narrow pantry listening to the rapid, shallow breaths of the woman who raised me. The anger that had propelled me through the sleet storm 2 days ago began to falter. Barbara was not a cartoon villain. She was a terrified, aging woman trying to patch the holes in a sinking ship. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood in South Boston and spent her entire adult life running from that poverty. The thought of losing everything and dragging her favored daughter down with her had broken her moral compass. "Please," Barbara begged, Tears spilled over her lower lashes. "Do not destroy your father over this. I am asking you to save us." A heavy, suffocating guilt settled over my chest. The logic of tax codes and legal boundaries felt useless in the face of my mother weeping in front of me. She was asking me to set myself on fire to keep the family warm. Have you ever looked at a parent and realized they were just a frightened adult out of options? How do you say no when saying no means turning them over to the authorities? If you have ever felt the crushing weight of family guilt paralyzing your ability to protect yourself, you understand why I hesitated. I reached out and touched the edge of the retroactive consent form. Signing the paper meant I lost the money, but I saved my father from a criminal investigation. It meant Haley got her fairy tale, and my mother avoided social humiliation. I picked up a pen sitting on the counter. The pressure was immense. The desire to simply end the conflict and fix the problem for them was a heavy biological pull. I hovered the tip of the pen over the signature line. Barbara watched my hand holding her breath. Before the ink could touch the paper, my cell phone vibrated in my blazer pocket. A loud, persistent buzz shattered the tense silence in the pantry. I pulled the phone out, expecting an email from my accounting firm regarding the upcoming partnership review. The screen displayed an unknown number with a Cape Cod area code. I ignored it and placed the phone back on the counter. But then a voicemail notification popped up on the lock screen. The transcription software previewed the first few lines of the audio message. I read the text glowing on the glass screen. My blood ran cold. The pen slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the marble counter. The desperation I just witnessed from my mother was only half the story. While she was crying about protecting Haley and saving my father, she was actively hiding a second devastating trap. Barbara had not just forged my name to raid a trust fund. She had taken my identity and weaponized it to secure the rest of the illusion. The financial disaster was no longer contained to a single regional bank in the Berkshires. The creditors were coming, and my name was printed on every single invoice. The automated voicemail transcription glowed bright white against the dark screen of my phone. It read, "This is Martin from Ocean Crest Catering, following up on the overdue second installment for the upcoming wedding reception. As the primary financial guarantor on the contract, we urgently need you to update your billing profile by end of day." I stared at the words. The heavy, suffocating guilt I felt moments ago evaporated. The pity I felt for my weeping mother vanished. I looked up from the screen. Barbara was staring at the phone, her face drained of color. The tears she had just weaponized against me were gone, replaced by a cold, rigid panic. I picked up the phone. I did not ask her for an explanation. I did not give her a chance to construct another lie. I dialed the Cape Cod area code and put the call on speaker. The dial tone echoed loudly in the narrow butler's pantry. Martin answered on the second ring. His voice was polite but carried the distinct professional edge of a vendor chasing unpaid invoices. I introduced myself as Layla and told him there had been a mistake. I explained that I was not the primary guarantor for the wedding and requested that he remove my name from his billing profile. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The sound of shuffling papers came through the speaker. Ms. Layla, Martin said, his tone dropping an octave. "We have a digitally executed master contract here. Your name, your billing address in Somerville, and your social security number were used to secure the credit line for our services. You are legally designated as the sole guarantor. If the upcoming $20,000 installment is not processed by Friday, we will be forced to send the account to collections." I asked him to email me the contract immediately. I ended the call and opened my inbox. A PDF attachment arrived 30 seconds later. I tapped the file to open it. It was a 20-page catering agreement detailing imported seafood stations, an open premium bar, and custom floral centerpieces. I scrolled past the decadent menu options straight to the final page. There at the bottom was my full legal name typed into the digital signature block. I expanded the document to view the electronic verification certificate. The digital ink was verified by an IP address. I checked the sequence of numbers against my memory. It was the exact same static IP address assigned to the wireless router sitting in my parents' Lexington living room. The exact same timestamp sequence that had authorized the fraudulent trust withdrawal. The $80,000 my mother had drained from the Generation Skipping Transfer Trust had not been enough. She had used those funds to secure the venue and buy the dress. But weddings of this magnitude require staged payments. When the stolen cash ran out, my parents had zero liquid assets remaining. They could not qualify for a line of credit because their own credit scores were ruined by their hidden bankruptcy. So Barbara pivoted. She used the personal information she had access to as a mother. She took my Social Security number, my clean credit history, and my professional credentials as an accountant. She used my identity to guarantee the remaining $45,000 in vendor contracts. My mother had not just borrowed from my future. She had chained me to a sinking ship. I looked at Barbara. She had backed away from the marble counter, pressing herself against the pantry shelves. She looked like a trapped animal. "You used my Social Security number," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. I did not yell. The anger sitting in my chest was too dense for screaming. Barbara squeezed her eyes shut. "The vendors required a guarantor with prime credit," she whispered. "Thomas could not pass the soft pull. Haley has no income. The catering company was going to cancel the booking, Layla. They were going to release the date. Brendan's family had already booked their hotel blocks in Chatham. If I lost the caterer, the whole wedding would collapse. I had to secure the contract." "You committed felony identity theft to buy lobsters," I replied. The panic I felt was no longer a theoretical fear of a bank audit. It was an immediate, visceral threat. These Cape Cod vendors did not care about the emotional nuances of a broken family. They operated small businesses with tight margins. They only cared about legally binding contracts. Because my name was listed as the sole guarantor, they had the legal right to bypass my parents entirely. When the Friday deadline arrived and the $20,000 installment failed to process, Ocean Crest Catering would send the debt to a commercial collection agency. The agency would immediately report the default to all 3 major credit bureaus. My pristine credit score would tank within 48 hours. The accounting firm where I worked monitored the credit profiles of all partnership track candidates. A sudden $45,000 commercial default would trigger an automatic suspension of my promotion. The collection agency could file a civil suit and garnish the wages from my personal business accounts. My mother had handed a loaded gun to strangers and pointed it directly at my career. What would you do if you realized your own mother had weaponized your identity to purchase an illusion? The terror in that moment is suffocating. You realize the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones actively feeding you to the wolves. If you have ever discovered a family member opening a credit card in your name, you know the specific betrayal that hollows out your stomach. I slid the retroactive consent form for the trust across the marble counter toward Barbara. I picked up my pen and snapped it in half, throwing the plastic shards into the trash bin. "I am not signing this," I said. Barbara lunged forward, grabbing my wrist. Her manicured nails dug into my skin. "Layla, please," she begged. "You cannot back out now. If you do not sign that form, the bank will arrest your father. If you do not cover the caterer, they will ruin your credit anyway. You are already involved. You have to help us fix this." She was right about the trap, but she was wrong about how I would dismantle it. She expected me to panic and absorb the debt to save my own credit score. She expected me to become the financial martyr my sister needed. I pulled my wrist out of her grip. "You fix this," I told her. "You and Dad figure out how to pay those vendors by Friday, because if my accounts are charged a single dime, I will walk into a police station and file a formal identity theft report." I turned around and grabbed the brass handle of the pantry door. "You wouldn't," Barbara hissed. Her voice dropped the pleading tone and hardened into a threat. "You will not send your own father to jail over a catering bill. You do not have the stomach to destroy this family." I opened the door, allowing the classical music and the chatter of wealthy guests to flood the narrow space. I did not look back at her. I walked straight through the living room, past the silver trays of champagne and the women admiring Haley's engagement ring. I retrieved my coat from the attendant and walked out into the cold New England air. My mother was banking on my emotional weakness. She believed my love for Thomas would prevent me from taking the necessary legal action to clear my name. She assumed my father was a passive victim in her scheme, someone I would blindly protect. But as I drove my sedan away from the Lexington house, a new painful reality began to solidify in my mind. Barbara could not have executed this level of financial fraud alone. The home equity line of credit required 2 signatures. The vendor guarantees required dual authorization. My mother was the architect of the illusion, but my father was the co-signer. I needed to know exactly how complicit he was. I needed to look Thomas in the eye and find out if the quiet, steady man who taught me how to ride a bicycle had willingly signed his name to my destruction. Because if I was going to dismantle the contracts and survive the audit, I had to know if I was fighting one parent or two. The answer I found the next morning would break whatever fragile loyalty I had left. The morning sun barely cut through the gray, overcast sky as I drove toward the waterfront. I bypassed the manicured suburbs and headed straight for the industrial side of Boston Harbor. The salt air coming through the car vents smelled of low tide and diesel fuel. It was a sharp contrast to the expensive floral arrangements choking my mother's living room the day before. I was not looking for Barbara. I already knew what she was capable of doing to preserve her social standing. I needed to find my father. I parked near a row of weathered wooden slips. Seagulls circled overhead, diving for scraps left behind by the commercial fishing crews. At the far end of the dock sat a 20-year-old fiberglass skiff. Thomas had purchased that small boat a decade ago during a lucrative bonus year at his logistics firm. He used to take Haley and me out on the water every summer. It was his sanctuary away from the suffocating pressure of Lexington society. Now it was just a decaying piece of property he could not afford to maintain. I spotted him sitting near the stern. He wore a faded flannel shirt and stained denim jeans. He held a putty knife in his right hand, quietly applying fiberglass resin to a deep crack in the hull. His posture was stooped. The man who used to command boardrooms now looked like a ghost haunting his own life. I walked down the wooden planks. My footsteps echoed over the lapping water. I had spent the entire drive rehearsing a calculated professional speech. I planned to lay out the financial liabilities, the legal consequences, and the exact timeline of the vendor defaults. I wanted to interrogate him with the detached precision of an auditor. But as I reached the end of the dock, the stoic accountant persona I relied on evaporated. The raw betrayal eclipsed my logic. I did not deliver a cinematic monologue. I stopped 3 feet away from him and threw my leather purse onto the wooden dock. The metal hardware cracked loudly against the planks. Thomas flinched, dropping his putty knife. He turned around to face me. I lost my temper. The carefully constructed professional boundaries tore wide open. I started yelling. The words tumbled out of my mouth in a jagged, unpredictable rhythm. I demanded to know how a father could sit at a dining room table and watch his wife forge their oldest daughter's signature. I asked him how he could sleep at night, knowing my Social Security number was being used to buy imported seafood for a party I did not even want to attend. Hot, angry tears spilled down my face. My chest heaved with every sentence. I screamed that my career was on the line. I yelled that the bank was auditing the trust and the caterers were threatening collections. I let him see the messy, unpolished terror his inaction had caused. I wanted him to defend himself. I wanted him to yell back and give me a reason to hate him. Thomas did not raise his voice. He did not offer a polished excuse. He looked at my tear-stained face, and his shoulders collapsed. The hollowed-out shell of the man who raised me seemed to shrink even further under the gray harbor sky. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a rag, wiping the toxic resin from his fingers. His hands were shaking. He looked down at the frayed ropes tying his boat to the cleat. "I signed them," he whispered. His voice was raspy and weak. The wind whipped across the water, carrying his confession. I stood frozen. "Your mother printed the catering contracts and the trust withdrawal forms." Thomas continued, keeping his eyes fixed on the wooden planks. "She told me the vendors were threatening to cancel the date. She said Brendan's family was asking questions about the deposits. I told her we had no money left. I told her the severance was gone." He looked up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and heavy with exhaustion. "Barbara said she only needed a bridge loan," he explained. "She said she could leverage the trust and use your credit profile just for a few months. She promised me that you would eventually agree to help us once you understood the stakes. She convinced me that if we just secured the venue, I would find a new executive job before the final payments were due. I thought I would get hired Layla. I had 3 interviews lined up. I thought I could replace the funds and pay off the vendors before you ever saw a single piece of paper." He took a ragged breath. "But the job offers never came. The industry moved on without me. I kept waking up every morning pretending to send out resumes while your mother spent money we did not have. When she put those forged contracts in front of me, I knew it was wrong. But I was so tired of failing. I was so tired of watching my wife panic. I signed my name right next to your forged signature as the secondary guarantor. I authorized the theft. The anger that had fueled my yelling slowly drained away, leaving behind a heavy, agonizing sadness. My father was not an evil mastermind calculating my ruin. He was a broken man who surrendered his integrity because he could no longer bear the shame of his own unemployment. Thomas buried his face in his calloused hands. A harsh sob racked his chest. He stood on the edge of the dock, weeping with the raw, unfiltered grief of a man who realized he had destroyed the one thing he was supposed to protect. "I failed you," he choked out, his voice muffled by his hands. "I failed your mother, and I failed Haley. I am supposed to be the provider. I am supposed to keep you safe. Instead, I let her use you to hide my own ruin. I am so sorry, Layla. I am so sorry." I stood on the dock listening to the gulls and the crying of my father. I wanted to stay furious. I needed to stay cold. The legal path to saving my career required ruthlessness. To clear my name from the vendor contracts and satisfy the bank audit, the correct procedure was simple. I had to walk into the local police precinct, hand them the printed IP logs, and file a formal identity theft report. Filing that report would immediately freeze the collections process. It would shield my credit score and secure my partnership promotion. It was the only logical step for an accountant facing a federal compliance audit. But watching my father weep into his hands, the logic fell apart. Reporting the forgery meant sending the police to arrest the man standing in front of me. It meant watching Thomas sit in a courtroom facing felony fraud charges. It meant stripping away the last remaining shreds of his dignity and putting him behind bars. The emotional messiness of the situation tangled around my ankles. My strict adherence to rules and regulations felt inadequate. I could not destroy a broken, remorseful old man to save my own credit score. My resolve to be cold and calculating shattered on that wooden dock. I realized I could not use the nuclear option. The police report was off the table. I picked up my purse from the wooden planks and brushed the dirt off the leather. I looked at Thomas. He was still crying, unable to meet my gaze. I did not offer him forgiveness. Forgiveness was a luxury we could not afford right now. I told him to go home and wait. I told him not to sign another document or answer another phone call from a vendor. I walked back to my car with a heavy, sinking realization. By taking the police report off the table, I was choosing to fight the vendors and the bank audit on my own. I was carrying the $45,000 liability back onto my own shoulders. I needed a legal strategy that could extract my name from those contracts without initiating a criminal investigation against my parents. I needed a loophole. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan and started the engine. The heater blasted warm air against my cold hands. I knew navigating this level of financial fraud without police intervention was going to require specialized legal armor. I could not outsmart the catering companies and the bank auditors using accounting spreadsheets alone. Furthermore, I could not dismantle this wedding while my sister remained in the dark. Haley was still operating under the assumption that the Cape Cod spectacle was a legitimate event. She was still holding her breath, terrified of disappointing our mother. If I was going to unweave this toxic financial web, I needed my sister to understand the truth about the foundation she was standing on. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for a seasoned attorney I occasionally consulted for complex tax litigation. I drafted a brief, urgent message requesting an immediate consultation. Then I opened a new text thread with Haley. I told her we needed to meet in Somerville as soon as possible. The truth about the $80,000 illusion was going to break her heart, but it was the only way to set us both free. Haley arrived at my Somerville apartment 2 hours after I sent the text message. She wore the same faded gray hoodie from her previous visit. She asked why I looked so exhausted. I did not offer a soft preamble or try to protect her feelings. I told her I had just spent the morning watching our father weep on a boat dock because he helped forge my signature. Haley stopped talking. I told her we were going for a drive to downtown Boston. I explained that the Cape Cod wedding was a financial crime scene and she needed to hear the exact legal facts from an objective third party. We drove down Interstate 93 in silence. The gray harbor sky had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle. Haley stared out the passenger window, watching the city skyline grow larger against the bleak horizon. The tension inside the car was thick with unspoken dread. She knew the illusion was fracturing, but she did not yet understand the staggering cost of the damage. My appointment was with a seasoned tax litigator named David. I occasionally consulted his practice for complex corporate audits. His office sat on the 14th floor of a high-rise in the financial district overlooking the Custom House. David was a pragmatic man who dealt in risk assessment and damage control. He did not offer emotional platitudes. He offered solutions. We sat in high-backed leather chairs across from his polished mahogany desk. I unzipped my briefcase and pulled out the evidence. I slid the home equity line of credit paperwork, the forged catering contracts, and the printed IP logs across the dark wood surface. David adjusted his glasses and began to read the fine print. I watched my sister process the physical documents. She stared at the signature line on the loan origination form. For the first few minutes, she retreated into denial. She shook her head, whispering that Barbara would never orchestrate something this reckless. She argued that there had to be a misunderstanding with the digital routing or the banking software. But as David laid out the IP timestamps and explained the mechanics of the cross-collateralized trust fund, the denial fractured into panic. Haley picked up the 20-page catering agreement. She read the itemized lists identifying the imported lobsters, the custom floral arches, and the premium bar service she had been forced to select to appease our mother. She realized every single champagne toast and linen napkin was purchased with my stolen future. The panic settled into a hollow, utter devastation. Haley dropped the papers onto the desk. She covered her mouth with trembling hands. The fairy tale wedding she hated was actually a financial cage our mother built using stolen parts. Haley looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, recognizing that she was the bait our parents used to justify their fraud. David stacked the papers into a neat pile. He looked at me with the detached sympathy of a lawyer who has seen money tear families apart for decades. He delivered the harsh reality check I had been dreading. I explained to him that I refused to file a formal police report against my father. I told him I needed to solve the vendor defaults without initiating a criminal investigation. David leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He told me that extracting my name from the vendor contracts without a police report was virtually impossible. Civil courts require a criminal complaint to invalidate a digitally executed guarantee. He broke down the timeline to illustrate the trap. A standard fraud investigation takes 6 to 8 months to process through the backlogged legal system. The Cape Cod wedding was scheduled to happen in 60 days, long before a judge could issue a stay or a police detective could verify the IP addresses the catering company would demand their next installment. When that $20,000 payment failed, they would immediately send the debt to commercial collections. David laid out the exact consequences for my career. The moment the collection agency reported the default, my credit profile would tank. My accounting firm would see the derogatory mark during my partnership background check. My promotion would be canceled. He explained there were no quick legal fixes to erase my name from the dotted line. If I wanted to avoid collections and keep my parents out of a federal courtroom, I could not rely on the slow grind of the justice system. I had to use financial strategy. David suggested I treat the situation like a failing corporate acquisition. I needed to restructure the debt, negotiate early cancellation penalties, and liquidate the liabilities before the due dates arrived. He pointed out a crucial detail hidden in the fine print of the catering agreements. The contracts contained a cancellation clause. If the event was canceled within a specific window, the guarantor was only liable for a percentage of the total cost instead of the full $45,000. He warned me that the longer we waited, the higher the penalty would climb. Every passing week locked in more non-refundable deposits. If we wanted to mitigate the damage, we had to act fast. It meant I had to engage the vendors directly and bargain my way out of the trap using my own leverage. We left the high-rise and walked out onto the damp Boston pavement. The freezing rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and reflective. Haley wrapped her arms around her stomach, shivering in the damp wind. She did not cry. The endless weeping she had done in my kitchen days prior was replaced by a quiet, focused determination. She looked at me with a new, profound clarity. The golden child illusion was dead. She apologized to me. She said she was sorry that our parents used my life to finance her performance. She promised she would do whatever it took to help me tear the wedding apart. We stood on the sidewalk united by a shared, terrifying reality. The $80,000 wedding was a bomb wired to detonate in 60 days. If we let the clock run out, it would destroy my career and send our parents to prison. We could not just cancel it openly because Barbara would escalate her lies to save face, and the vendors would still demand their guarantees. We had to dismantle the event from the inside. We had to quietly unweave the contracts, negotiate the penalties, and restructure the debt without tipping off our mother. It was the first time in our lives we were truly on the same side. We were no longer the forgotten daughter and the pressured golden child. We were partners facing a hostile corporate takeover. I unlocked my car and we climbed inside. The plan was dangerous and carried a heavy financial risk. I was going to have to use my own savings to bait the trap and force my parents into a corner. I started the engine, knowing the next phase required me to step out of the shadows and take control of the ledger. I had to face the Cape Cod vendors directly and calculate the exact price of our freedom. I dropped Haley off at her apartment and drove back to Somerville. The emotional exhaustion of the morning was replaced by a sharp clinical focus. I am an accountant trained to manage distressed assets and restructure corporate liabilities. My parents had essentially orchestrated a hostile takeover of my financial identity. I needed to execute a countermaneuver to neutralize their leverage. I sat down at my kitchen island, opened my laptop, and began building the architecture of my defense. The first step was isolating the immediate threat. The Cape Cod vendors held the power to destroy my credit profile. If I let the Friday deadline pass, the default would initiate a chain reaction of collections and civil suits. I needed to cut the fuse before the bomb detonated. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Ocean Crest Catering. I bypassed Martin, the mid-level manager, who had left the threatening voicemail. I navigated the corporate directory until I reached the owner of the company. A woman named Claire answered the line. Her tone was brisk and guarded, anticipating another excuse for a delayed payment. I did not offer excuses. I utilized the precise, unvarnished vocabulary I used during high-stakes corporate negotiations. I informed Claire that the upcoming $80,000 wedding was experiencing severe structural financing issues. I stated plainly that the primary funding source had evaporated. Claire sighed audibly. She began reciting the standard legal consequences for breaking a digitally executed guarantee. She reminded me that my signature legally bound me to the full $45,000 remaining balance. I stopped her mid-sentence. I told her I was fully aware of the digital signatures. I also informed her that I possessed certified IP logs, proving those signatures were executed from a residential router in Lexington while I was physically sitting in my accounting office in Boston. I let the silence hang over the phone line, allowing her to calculate the implications. I did not threaten to call the police. I simply explained the reality of civil litigation. If she pursued me for the $45,000, I would challenge the contract in court based on identity theft. The litigation would drag on for 2 years. Her catering company would spend thousands in legal fees trying to collect on a forged document. She would eventually lose the case and collect nothing. Or I offered shifting to a more collaborative tone. We can execute a cancellation penalty right now. You release the date. You keep the initial deposits. My parents already paid using the stolen trust money. We calculate a flat, non-refundable penalty fee to cover your administrative losses, and you draft a clean release of liability freeing me from the forged guarantee. Claire was a pragmatic business owner. She recognized a losing battle when she saw one. She preferred a guaranteed partial payment over a protracted legal fight against a corporate accountant. We spent the next 40 minutes hammering out the details. I aggressively pushed back against her itemized cancellation fees, stripping away the artificial markups for the imported seafood and premium alcohol. By the time we concluded the negotiation, I had managed to reduce the staggering $45,000 liability down to a flat $12,000 penalty. I secured the same reduction agreements with the florist and the venue coordinator using the exact same strategy. The crippling vendor debt was neutralized. However, I refused to absorb the $12,000 penalty. I have spent my entire adult life watching my mother force other people to pay for her mistakes. I was not going to be the financial martyr who bailed out her social ambitions. I had mitigated the disaster, but the bill still belonged to the architects of the fraud. I drafted a detailed summary of the negotiated penalties and emailed the file to David, my tax litigator. I instructed him to structure a liability transfer. We needed to legally shift the $12,000 debt directly back to Barbara and Thomas. David drafted a watertight promissory note. The document was a masterclass in financial coercion. It explicitly stipulated that Barbara and Thomas Caldwell must assume full legal responsibility for the $12,000 vendor cancellation fees. Furthermore, the note included a strict amortization schedule requiring them to repay the stolen trust funds directly to me with interest over the next 5 years. I built the paperwork meticulously, ensuring the mathematical logic was undeniable. Every figure was backed by a corresponding bank statement or vendor invoice. There was no room for emotional manipulation or convenient memory lapses. The numbers told a cold chronological story of theft and recovery. The promissory note was designed as a legal cage. I included a severe trigger clause. If my parents refused to sign the document assuming the debt, the cancellation protections I had negotiated with the vendors would immediately void. The catering company, the florist, and the venue would instantly pursue my parents for the full $45,000 balance. Since my parents had zero liquid cash and ruined credit scores, a $45,000 civil judgment would force them into immediate public bankruptcy. The Lexington Country Club Society would witness their financial collapse in real time. The illusion of wealth Barbara had spent her life cultivating would shatter in front of her neighbors. I was presenting them with a binary choice. They could comply, sign the promissory note, and accept a quiet, structured repayment plan, or they could refuse and face total public ruin. I was no longer the quiet, compliant daughter waiting for my mother to dictate the terms of my life. I was the primary creditor holding the deed to their reputation. I printed the final documents and arranged them in a leather portfolio. The stack of paper felt heavy with authority. I had successfully dismantled the external threats and isolated the conflict. I had a clear path to clear my name and protect my CPA license. But a significant variable remained unchecked. Haley and I were working in secret, but the wedding involved two families. Brendan, the wealthy heir from the old Boston family, was entirely unaware of the chaos unfolding behind the scenes. He still believed he was marrying into a stable, prosperous household. He still believed the $80,000 Cape Cod spectacle was a legitimate event moving forward as planned. If Haley and I were going to detonate this financial bomb, we needed to control the blast radius. We could not blindside Brendan at the last minute. His reaction could complicate our strategy or, worse, push Haley back into our mother's toxic orbit out of fear of losing her relationship. I needed to know if Brendan was marrying my sister because he loved her or if he was simply playing his part in a high society merger. I needed to bring him into the fold and show him the ugly, unvarnished truth about the family he was about to join. His reaction to the stolen money and the forged contracts would dictate the final phase of our plan. I called Haley and told her it was time to bring the groom to the table. The fluorescent lights of the Somerville diner buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the Formica table. It was a local spot miles away from the polished, upscale restaurants my mother preferred. The air smelled of stale coffee and fried potatoes. Haley sat across from me, tracing the rim of a ceramic mug with a trembling finger. She looked terrified. The door chimed and Brendan walked in. Brendan came from the kind of old Boston money that did not need to announce itself. He wore a simple wool sweater and worn leather boots. His family owned sprawling estates and generated quiet generational wealth, but they drove old Volvos and avoided public displays of affluence. He was stoic, fiercely private, and deeply traditional. He possessed the exact pedigree Barbara coveted, but none of the ostentatious behavior she associated with it. He slid into the vinyl booth next to Haley, kissing the top of her head. He sensed the heavy atmosphere immediately. He looked at my serious expression and then at Haley's red-rimmed eyes. He asked us what was wrong. Haley took a deep breath. She did not try to soften the blow or protect our family's image. She laid the ugly truth out on the sticky table. She told Brendan about the forged home equity line of credit. She explained how Barbara raided my trust fund to secure the venue. She confessed that the vendor contracts were signed using my stolen identity. She told him the $80,000 Cape Cod spectacle was a mirage built on federal fraud. I watched Brendan process the information. The muscles in his jaw tightened. His stoic demeanor remained intact, but his eyes widened with quiet shock. Wealthy families deal with their fair share of hidden scandals, but blatant identity theft and forged bank documents crossed a severe line. Haley gripped her coffee mug, her knuckles white, fully expecting him to stand up and walk out of the diner. She believed the revelation of our toxic, fractured family would convince him to call off the engagement. Instead, Brendan reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. He did not pull away. He looked at Haley with a profound, unvarnished empathy. He thanked her for telling him the truth. He said he knew something had been wrong for months. He had watched her shrink under Barbara's intense planning demands. He noticed the constant anxiety shadowing her every move. He told her he was marrying her, not her family's balance sheet. Then Brendan turned to me. He exhaled a long, slow breath and leaned back against the vinyl booth. He revealed a piece of the puzzle that shifted my understanding of the entire crisis. When Haley and I first got engaged, Brendan said, his voice low and steady. My parents invited Thomas and Barbara to our house in Concord for dinner. We sat in the study and discussed the logistics of the wedding. My father knows the economy has been tough on the logistics industry. He suspected Thomas might be facing financial headwinds, even though Thomas never admitted it. Brendan paused, tapping his fingers against the table. My parents offered to host the wedding entirely, he explained. They proposed a modest, elegant ceremony at our family cabin in the Berkshire Mountains. They offered to cover all the expenses for a private catered weekend. They wanted to relieve the financial burden so Haley could just enjoy being a bride. I stared at him, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Barbara refused the money, I stated, recognizing the pattern of her toxic pride. Brendan nodded. She was highly offended by the offer. She stood up in my parents' study and delivered a lengthy speech about tradition. She insisted the bride's family must host the event. She claimed the Caldwells were more than capable of throwing an extravagant affair that would honor our family's social standing. She told my mother that accepting charity would be humiliating. She essentially demanded the massive Cape Cod spectacle just to prove she belonged in the same room as my parents. The scope of my mother's delusion expanded in my mind. The $80,000 fraud was not born out of necessity. It was not a desperate scramble to give her daughter a normal wedding. Barbara had a free, elegant alternative handed to her on a silver platter. Brendan's family offered a generous, graceful exit from the financial pressure. But Barbara rejected the lifeline because a private cabin in the Berkshires did not offer an audience. An elegant family gathering would not generate the glossy photographs she needed to impress the women at her country club. She chose to steal my trust fund, forge my identity, and risk a federal investigation solely to protect her own fragile ego. Her toxic pride was the singular engine driving this impending catastrophe. Haley sat beside Brendan, tears streaming down her face. She realized our mother had jeopardized her future marriage just to win an imaginary status competition. The final remaining shreds of Haley's loyalty to Barbara dissolved in that diner booth. Brendan looked at his fiancée, wiping a tear from her cheek. "We are not doing the Cape Cod wedding," he said firmly. "I do not care about the venue or the guest list. I just want to marry you. If your mother wants a circus, she can pay for it herself. We are going to elope." He offered a concrete alternative. He suggested they take a small group of friends up to the cabin in the Berkshires next week. They could hire a local officiant, order some good food, and exchange vows without the suffocating pressure of an audience. He removed the final emotional obstacle standing in our way. Haley did not have to choose between exposing our mother and losing her groom. Brendan was offering her a clean escape hatch. Haley agreed immediately. The relief washing over her face was palpable. She looked lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted off her chest. We sat in the diner for another hour, finalizing the strategy. I briefed Brendan on the legal trap I had constructed. I explained the cancellation penalties, the promissory note, and the liability transfer I planned to present to my parents. Brendan fully supported the aggressive financial maneuver. He agreed that Barbara and Thomas needed to face the harsh mathematical consequences of their choices. I paid the diner check and we walked out into the cool evening air. The alliance was complete. I had the legal documents drafted and verified. I had successfully neutralized the vendor threats and secured a structured repayment plan. Most importantly, I had the groom firmly on our side, ensuring Haley's future remained intact. We held the complete upper hand. The lavish $80,000 wedding was officially a ghost. But Barbara did not know that yet. My mother was still operating under the assumption that her grand illusion was proceeding exactly as planned. She still believed she held all the leverage. She thought her forged documents were secure and her country club status was guaranteed. She was about to invite me back into the epicenter of her fantasy, and I was preparing to walk through her front door, carrying a leather briefcase filled with the heavy, undeniable weight of reality. The stage was set for a final reckoning, and the audience she desperately craved was going to witness the collapse of her empire. The invitation arrived via a group text message on Thursday morning. Barbara summoned everyone to the Lexington house for what she called the final planning summit. She requested the presence of the wedding planner Brendan, his parents Haley, and me. She framed it as a celebratory evening to finalize the seating charts and select the specific linen weaves for the reception tables. I read the message while sitting at my desk in Boston. I replied that I would be there. When I pulled into my parents' driveway that evening, the autumn air was crisp and biting. The house looked exactly as it always did. The manicured hedges bordered the brick walkway. The porch lights cast a warm, inviting glow against the colonial facade. From the street, it was the picture of suburban stability. I turned off my engine and sat in the quiet car for a long moment. Resting on the passenger seat was my leather briefcase. Inside that bag were the signed vendor cancellation receipts, the finalized promissory note, and the liability transfer documents drafted by my attorney. The paperwork was organized into neat individual folders. I picked up the briefcase. It felt heavier than usual. The leather handle dug into my palm as I walked up the brick path. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of expensive cedar candles and roasting tenderloin. Laughter drifted from the formal dining room. I hung my coat in the hall closet and walked toward the voices. The scene in the dining room was staged with theatrical precision. Barbara had brought out the good crystal and the sterling silver serving trays. She stood at the head of the long mahogany table, pouring a vintage sparkling wine into fluted glasses. Brendan sat next to Haley on one side. His parents, James and Catherine, sat opposite them. The wedding planner, a brisk woman named Sylvia, occupied the far end of the table. Her space was covered in glossy brochures, fabric swatches, and oversized floor plans, mapping out a venue that I had legally voided 3 days ago. Thomas sat quietly in the corner nursing a glass of bourbon. He did not look up when I entered the room. Barbara spotted me, and her smile stretched wide. "Layla is here," she announced to the room, gesturing for me to take the empty chair next to Catherine. "Now we can finalize the arrangements. We could not do this without our financial guardian angel." I took my seat and placed my briefcase on the floor right next to my ankle. The dramatic irony in the room was thick enough to choke on. I sat quietly watching my mother play the role of the affluent matriarch. She handed a crystal flute to Catherine, chatting breezily about the logistical challenges of hosting 300 guests on the Cape. Catherine offered a polite, tight-lipped smile. Brendan's parents came from a world where discussing money was considered crude. They sat with quiet dignity, enduring Barbara's relentless boasting. They already knew Barbara had rejected their offer to host a modest, elegant wedding in the mountains. They were watching a woman overcompensate. Sylvia, the wedding planner, leaned forward and unrolled a glossy diagram. "This is the layout for the cocktail hour," she explained, tapping a manicured finger on the paper. "We have positioned the raw bar near the terrace to give the guests a view of the ocean while they eat." Barbara clapped her hands together. "The raw bar is going to be spectacular," she told James and Catherine. "We secured 50 imported Atlantic lobsters. I insisted on the best catering tier. The seafood alone is a fortune, but Haley deserves an opulent presentation. We want your extended family to experience true New England hospitality." My stomach tied itself into a cold, hard knot. I looked down at the floor where my briefcase rested against my shoe. Inside the front pocket was a signed PDF from Claire at Ocean Crest Catering. The document clearly stated that the imported lobster order was officially canceled. The raw bar did not exist. The caterer had released the date. Barbara was bragging about a luxurious seafood display that was currently reduced to a $12,000 penalty fee written in my legal files. Sylvia pulled out another folder. Now regarding the floral arrangements, she said, sliding a series of photographs across the wood. The florist confirmed they can source the white orchids for the custom floral arches framing the altar. It will require a secondary shipping fee due to the season, but it will create a breathtaking aesthetic. It is worth every penny, Barbara interjected, waving her hand dismissively at the mention of the fee. The arches will frame the photographs beautifully. I told the florist not to compromise on the volume. I took a slow sip of my water. I possessed the voided contract for those exact white orchids. I had personally negotiated the florist down to a minor administrative cancellation charge just 48 hours prior. There were no arches, there were no orchids, there was no venue. I glanced across the table at Haley. She sat frozen, gripping her water glass with both hands. She looked terrified. Brendan rested his hand on her knee beneath the table, offering a silent anchor. He met my eyes for a fraction of a second. His expression was stoic, but I could see the quiet astonishment in his posture. He was witnessing the sheer magnitude of my mother's delusion in real time. He watched Barbara serve expensive wine and brag about non-existent luxury, knowing she had stolen my identity to finance the lies. I did not feel a sense of triumphant superiority. This was not a victory lap. As I listened to the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, a wave of genuine anxiety washed over me. This was my childhood home. I grew up eating cereal at this very table. I learned how to do division sitting under that same chandelier. Detonating a financial bomb in the middle of your own family does not feel like winning. It feels like tearing down a load-bearing wall in your own house. You know it has to happen to stop the rot, but you still have to stand in the rubble when the dust settles. Barbara continued her performance. She pointed out the custom gold-rimmed charger plates Sylvia had selected for the dinner service. She detailed the string quartet she planned to hire for the guest arrival. She was spinning a fairy tale out of thin air, wrapping herself in a blanket of forged signatures and stolen equity. She thought she had outsmarted the bank. She thought she had bullied me into submission at the bridal shower. She believed her social standing was bulletproof. I felt a drop of cold sweat slide down my spine. The urge to pick up my briefcase and walk out the front door was a strong biological pull. I could leave the documents on the kitchen counter and drive away. I could let her find the truth on her own without the audience. But my training as an auditor demanded accountability. Leaving the paperwork on a counter would only give Barbara the opportunity to spin another lie. She would find a way to manipulate Thomas or guilt Haley into another destructive compromise. The rot had to be exposed in the light. The meeting stretched on for another 20 minutes. Sylvia stacked her brochures and finalized her notes. She looked around the table with a bright professional smile. "I believe we have covered all the major design elements," Sylvia said, closing her binder. "If everyone is comfortable with these selections, I will send the final confirmation emails to the vendors tomorrow morning." Barbara raised her champagne flute high into the air. The crystal caught the light from the chandelier. She looked at James and Catherine and then smiled directly at me. To a flawless event, Barbara toasted, her voice ringing with unearned pride. To family and to a day none of us will ever forget. The room waited for the clink of the glasses. Brendan did not raise his drink. Haley stared down at her lap. Thomas remained silent in his corner. I reached down and placed my hand on the brass latch of my leather briefcase. The metal was cool against my skin. The performance was over. The audience was seated. It was time to show them the math. I did not raise my glass. I left my water untouched on the linen tablecloth. Barbara stood at the head of the table, holding her crystal flute in the air, waiting for the room to join her toast. The silence in the dining room stretched for a few heavy, agonizing seconds. The cheerful facade began to crack. Catherine lowered her glass, returning it to the table with a soft clink. James crossed his arms over his chest. Barbara's smile faltered. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "Layla?" She prompted, her voice tight with forced brightness. "We are toasting your sister." I kept my hands resting flat on the polished mahogany table. I looked directly at my mother. Before I opened my briefcase to discuss the vendor arrangements, I said, my voice steady and low, "We need to clarify the accounting of the trust withdrawal." Barbara's posture went rigid. The glass in her hand trembled slightly, spilling a drop of champagne onto the table runner. She shot a panicked glance toward James and Catherine, attempting to gauge their reaction to the word trust. "This is not the time for financial bookkeeping," Layla Barbara hissed, maintaining her wide, artificial smile. "We are celebrating with our guests. It is exactly the time," I replied. I did not raise my voice, but the authority in my tone cut through the ambient noise of the room. Sylvia, the wedding planner, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, sensing the sudden hostility. Thomas gripped his glass of bourbon, staring at the floorboards. As a corporate auditor, I am trained to follow every dollar to its final destination. When a ledger does not balance it, indicates a secondary problem hidden beneath the primary issue. The numbers surrounding this $80,000 event had bothered me for weeks. The math never fully aligned. I looked at Haley, who was watching me with wide, apprehensive eyes. The forged vendor contracts for the caterer, the florist, and the venue coordinator totaled $45,000. Even accounting for initial deposits and administrative fees, the wedding expenses did not consume the entire $80,000 home equity line of credit my parents had illegally secured against my grandfather's trust. There was a massive discrepancy sitting on the ledger. $35,000 was unaccounted for. Earlier that week, I had spent an evening meticulously cross-referencing the bank statements retrieved during my initial investigation. I tracked the routing numbers attached to the wire transfers. I assumed my parents had hidden the remaining cash in a separate savings account to cover future mortgage payments or basic living expenses after my father lost his pension. I expected to find a desperate survival fund. What I found was far more sickening. The missing $35,000 did not go into a savings account. It was not used to pay the property taxes on the Lexington house or cover the utility bills. The funds were routed directly to two major credit card companies. I accessed the payment histories tied to those specific routing numbers. The statements detailed a long, reckless timeline of expenditures. The charges were not for groceries or medical bills. They were itemized transactions for high-end department stores located in the Back Bay. There were recurring monthly charges for the Lexington Country Club membership dues. There were charges for private tennis lessons and expensive salon appointments. Barbara had not just maxed out the credit cards trying to survive after Thomas lost his job. She had actively continued spending money at an alarming rate solely to maintain her affluent lifestyle. She refused to let the other women at the country club suspect her husband was unemployed. She kept buying designer clothes and hosting expensive luncheons on credit, building a mountain of unsecured debt behind her husband's back. When the credit card companies threatened to cancel her accounts and file judgments against her, Barbara panicked. She needed a massive cash injection to wipe out the debt and avoid social humiliation. But she could not access a traditional loan without Thomas discovering the extent of her reckless spending. She needed a socially acceptable cover story to justify rating a high-value asset. She needed an excuse to forge the signatures and secure the home equity line of credit against my trust fund. The $80,000 Cape Cod wedding was that cover story. Barbara used the wedding as a shield. She convinced Thomas that the high society event was necessary to secure Haley's future with Brendan's wealthy family. She used my sister's vulnerability and my father's guilt to manipulate them into authorizing the fraud. But the wedding was never the primary objective. It was just the vehicle Barbara used to execute a financial bailout for herself. She used $45,000 of the stolen money to pay the wedding vendors, keeping the illusion alive long enough to secure the loan. She then quietly funneled the remaining $35,000 to pay off her secret credit card debt. Haley was never the true beneficiary of this crime. My sister was the scapegoat. Barbara had forced Haley to endure the suffocating pressure of a massive wedding planning process solely to disguise her own financial ruin. Armed with this final piece of leverage, I sat at the dining room table, looking at the woman who orchestrated the disaster. Barbara stared back at me, her breathing shallow and fast. She knew I had access to the tax portals. She knew I possessed the skills to trace the wire transfers. "Where did the rest of the money go, Mom?" I asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Barbara set her champagne flute down on the table. The crystal rang sharply against the wood. "I do not know what you are talking about," she replied, her voice wavering. "Every dollar went towards securing this beautiful event for your sister. We spared no expense." I reached down and unlatched the brass locks on my leather briefcase. The metallic clicks echoed in the quiet room. I pulled out a manila folder and set it on the mahogany table. "That is mathematically incorrect," I stated. "The vendor contracts account for $45,000. The line of credit you secured using my forged signature was for $80,000. Thomas looked up from his glass of bourbon. His brow furrowed in confusion. "Barbara told me the venue deposits consumed the entire loan," he said, his voice raspy. I opened the manila folder and extracted the printed credit card statements. I slid the documents across the polished table toward my father. "She lied to you, Dad," I said calmly. $35,000 was wired directly to her personal credit accounts to pay off the country club dues and the department store charges she accumulated after you lost your pension. She did not steal my trust fund just to pay for Haley's wedding. She used my sister's wedding as an excuse to steal my trust fund and bail out her own spending habits." The silence that followed was absolute. The grandfather clock ticking in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Thomas picked up the credit card statements. His eyes scanned the itemized charges. He read the names of the expensive boutiques and the dates of the country club luncheons. The dates corresponded to the exact months he had been sitting in his home office, desperately sending out resumes trying to save their home from foreclosure. He realized his wife had continued bleeding their finances dry while he was suffocating under the weight of his unemployment. Thomas looked at Barbara. The expression on his face shifted from broken shame to a cold, terrifying anger. "You let me believe this was for our daughter," he whispered. "You made me forge my own child's signature because you said we had no other way to protect Haley's future." Barbara shrank away from him. "Thomas, please," she pleaded, her voice thin and desperate. "I had to maintain our image. If people knew you were unemployed, we would have been ostracized. I did it for us." Thomas dropped the papers onto the table. He did not yell. The betrayal was too deep for screaming. He simply turned away from her, staring blankly at the wall. Haley sat next to Brendan, staring at the credit card statements resting on the wood. She realized she had spent the last 6 months enduring relentless anxiety, trying to be the perfect bride for a wedding she hated. She realized she had absorbed our mother's toxic pressure, believing she was responsible for the family's financial strain. The crushing weight she had carried was a complete fabrication. She was nothing more than a prop in our mother's desperate scheme to keep her country club membership active. Brendan wrapped his arm around Haley, pulling her closer to him. He glared at Barbara with unchecked disgust. His parents, James and Catherine, sat in stunned silence, witnessing the grotesque reality hiding beneath the glossy suburban facade. Barbara looked around the dining room. She saw the disgust in her future son-in-law's eyes. She saw the quiet horror on Catherine's face. The wealthy matriarchs she had spent her life trying to impress were watching her crumble. The illusion was dead, but I was not finished. Exposing the motive was only the preamble. The structural damage remained. The forged contracts were still active and the audit was still pending. I reached back into my briefcase. It was time to introduce the legal consequences and show the room exactly how I intended to balance the ledger. Barbara scrambled to rebuild her shattered facade. She turned her attention away from the credit card statements and focused entirely on Brendan's parents. She forced a high-pitched, brittle laugh that echoed painfully against the mahogany walls. "Every family experiences minor accounting disputes," Barbara said, addressing James and Catherine. Her voice trembled, but she pushed forward with an artificial strength. "We can sort out the trust paperwork privately. The details of our personal finances are not meant for the dinner table. What matters tonight is that the Cape Cod event is fully secured. We are here to finalize the seating charts and celebrate Haley. The opulence of the day is guaranteed." I watched her perform. She stood in the center of her own wreckage, surrounded by evidence of theft and deceit, and she was still trying to sell tickets to the show. Her delusion was profound. She truly believed she could compartmentalize the fraud and maintain her social standing if she just kept smiling. I reached into my leather briefcase. I bypassed the tax forms and pulled out 3 thick manila envelopes. I placed them on the polished table right next to the untouched sterling silver serving trays. I slid the first envelope down the wood toward Sylvia, the wedding planner. I pushed the second and third envelopes toward my mother. "There will be no seating charts," I stated. My tone was flat and even. I did not raise my voice to compete with her rising panic. "The Cape Cod wedding is canceled." Barbara stared at the envelopes like they were venomous snakes. "Do not be ridiculous, Layla," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. You cannot cancel a private event you did not plan. You do not hold the authority to alter our arrangements. I can cancel an event that was legally bound to my Social Security number, I replied. I instructed Sylvia to open the envelope resting in front of her. The planner hesitated, glancing nervously around the tense room. She slipped her manicured finger under the flap and pulled out the paperwork. They were the official termination releases from Ocean Crest Catering, the floral designer, and the venue coordinator. Sylvia read the formal legal language printed on the heavy stock paper. Her professional demeanor dissolved into pure, unadulterated shock. The vendors had officially released the dates and closed the accounts. "These are voided contracts," Sylvia whispered, looking up at Barbara. "The vendors accepted a penalty fee and terminated all service agreements. The event is gone." Barbara shook her head in rapid, jerky movements. She turned back to Brendan's parents, desperately attempting to spin the disaster. "This is just a stressful misunderstanding," she insisted. "Layla works excessive hours at her accounting firm. The corporate stress makes her prone to these dramatic outbursts. She is confused. She does not have the legal authority to alter our vendor agreements." Catherine did not offer a polite nod. Brendan's mother looked at Barbara with a chilling, quiet judgment. Old New England money does not tolerate public scenes or erratic behavior. Catherine recognized a fraud when she saw one. Her posture grew stiff and distant. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my own folder. It was a printed spreadsheet detailing the electronic verification certificates provided by the catering company. "You secured the catering contracts using an electronic signature platform," I explained to the room. "You typed my legal name into the guarantor field. You submitted my personal billing address in Somerville. You entered my Social Security number to pass the commercial credit check." Barbara's face tightened into a hard, furious mask. "I did no such thing," she hissed. "You verbally authorized those payments. You are lying right now because you want to ruin your sister's happiness out of pure spite and jealousy." Her attempt to pivot the blame onto me was a familiar childhood tactic. Growing up, she always framed my independence as selfishness. But emotional manipulation holds zero weight against a forensic audit. I held up the printed spreadsheet so the entire table could see the stark black text. Digital signatures generate an encrypted audit trail. This is the official IT log from the vendor's legal portal. It records the exact time, date, and origin of the signature execution. I read the data out loud. The cadence of my voice was deliberate. I recited the date. It was a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks ago. I recited the time. 4:15 in the afternoon. I read the long sequence of numbers constituting the IP address. I turned my gaze to my father. "Dad," I said, holding his attention, 3 weeks ago, I came over for Sunday dinner. I sat in the living room with you watching a baseball game on the television. Mom sat at the kitchen island with her iPad. She claimed she was browsing the internet for new appetizer recipes. Thomas closed his eyes. The muscles in his jaw clenched as he recognized the exact memory. At 4:15, I continued while I was sitting 50 feet away in your living room. The IP address registered to this house transmitted a forged signature to a catering company on Cape Cod. You sat next to her and let her steal my identity while I was a guest under your own roof. The dining room went dead silent. The truth was cold, mathematically precise, and entirely devastating. There was no room left for Barbara to maneuver. The evidence was tangible and indisputable. She could not charm her way out of an IP log. Sylvia, the wedding planner, stood up from her chair. Her face was flushed with fierce indignation. She operated a highly reputable business and relied almost exclusively on affluent clients. Discovering she had spent months facilitating a federal crime was a liability she could not afford. Her reputation in the Boston event industry was her most valuable asset. "I am terminating my services effective immediately," Sylvia announced. She gathered her glossy brochures, fabric swatches, and oversized floor plans with sharp, hurried movements. "Any outstanding consulting fees will be sent directly to your legal counsel. Do not contact my office again." Sylvia marched out of the dining room. The heavy oak front door shut a moment later, sending a hollow echo through the quiet house. Barbara stood at the head of the table holding her empty champagne flute. The grand illusion she spent her life building was reduced to scattered papers and revoked contracts. The opulent stage she had set was burning to the ground. James and Catherine stood up together. They did not yell or cause a scene. Their exit was worse than a screaming match. It was a formal, polite dismissal. "We think it is best if we leave. James said softly, placing a protective hand on his wife's back. He looked at Thomas with a mixture of pity and sorrow. He did not look at Barbara at all. Brendan remained seated next to Haley. He held her hand firmly, refusing to abandon his fiancée in the wreckage of her family's living room. He sat like an anchor, keeping Haley grounded while the storm raged around them. Thomas covered his face with his hands again. The reality of his complicity hung over him like a heavy shroud. He allowed his wife to turn his home into a factory for fraud. He traded his oldest daughter's future to avoid a difficult conversation about money. He sat in the corner, defeated and exposed. I looked at the polished mahogany table, the untouched crystal glasses, and the expensive roasting tenderloin sitting cold on the sideboard. None of it was real. It was a stage set, purchased with stolen equity. The wealth Barbara grandstanded about moments earlier was nothing more than a criminal liability. The confrontation had reached its peak, but the financial ledger was still unbalanced. I had successfully canceled the contracts, exposed the motive, and dismantled the wedding. But the $12,000 cancellation penalty remained active. The stolen trust funds were still missing from my account. Exposing the truth to Brendan's parents did not magically restore the money or satisfy the pending bank audit. I needed a physical signature. I needed my parents to legally assume the burden of their choices before the compliance window closed and my accounting career was destroyed. I reached into my briefcase one last time. I bypassed the tax records and pulled out a thick manila folder containing the promissory note and the liability transfer documents drafted by my litigator. I stood up from my chair and walked around the table, placing the documents directly in front of my father. The truth had been revealed, but the penalty had to be enforced. I prepared to deliver the ultimatum that would permanently bind them to the consequences of their deception. I stood at the side of the dining table looking down at my father. I slid the heavy stack of legal documents out of the manila folder and squared the edges against the polished wood. The top sheet was the promissory note, drafted by my litigator. Attached beneath it was the formal liability transfer agreement for the $12,000 vendor cancellation penalty. I retrieved a sleek metal pen from my blazer pocket and laid it precisely across the signature block. Thomas stared at the ink pen. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. "You have two choices," I said, keeping my voice level and deliberate. I did not need to shout. The legal architecture I had built spoke loud enough for the entire room. I pointed to the first document. "You sign this repayment agreement acknowledging the stolen trust funds. You commit to a strict 5-year amortization schedule with fixed interest to restore the principal you authorized my mother to take." I shifted my finger to the second document. "Then you sign this liability transfer. You legally assume the $12,000 in non-refundable cancellation penalties I negotiated with the Cape Cod vendors. Because you have zero liquid cash in your checking accounts, you will cover this debt by liquidating your equity share in the Lexington Country Club tomorrow morning." Barbara gasped. The sound was a sharp, panicked intake of air. The Lexington Country Club was not just a golf course to my mother. It was the epicenter of her identity. Years ago, when Thomas first earned his executive promotion, joining that exclusive organization was her ultimate triumph. She spent decades cultivating relationships in that clubhouse, fighting for spots on the charity committees, and organizing summer galas. The membership carried a substantial equity stake that members could sell back to the board upon resignation. Liquidating that equity meant immediate permanent expulsion from her high society circle. It meant admitting defeat. "You cannot ask us to do that," Barbara shrieked, her composure breaking into jagged, hysterical fragments. "That club is our community. It is my life. If we sell our equity, the board will know we are destitute. The rumors will ruin us." I looked at her without a trace of sympathy. "You ruined yourselves," I replied. "The choice is yours. You sign the paperwork right now, liquidate the equity, and assume the debt you created. If you refuse, I will pack up my briefcase, walk out the front door, and drive straight to the local police precinct. I will hand a detective the IP logs and file felony forgery charges against both of you." Barbara's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are destroying this family," she yelled. "You are a vindictive, ungrateful child. I gave you everything. I built a beautiful life for you and your sister, and you are tearing it apart because you care more about your bank account than your own flesh and blood. You are humiliating us on purpose." She turned wildly toward the foyer where Brendan's parents were retrieving their coats. She desperately tried to salvage the unsalvageable. "James, Catherine, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Do not listen to her. Layla is deeply unwell. We are a good family." James and Catherine did not stop walking. They offered a final tight nod to Brendan before stepping out into the cold autumn night and closing the door behind them. The quiet click of the latch was the sound of Barbara's social standing, dying a sudden, permanent death. Barbara spun back around her chest, heaving. She lunged toward the table as if she might sweep the legal documents onto the floor. "This wedding is still happening," she demanded, tears of fury spilling down her cheeks. "We will find another caterer. We will fix the funding. Haley is not going to suffer because her sister is a rigid, unfeeling accountant." This is the moment the dynamic in the room fundamentally shifted. For 27 years, Haley had shrunk away from conflict. She had absorbed our mother's relentless pressure, internalizing every critique and bending to every demand. She had developed an eating disorder in high school just to fit into the pageant dresses Barbara bought her. She had endured crippling panic attacks at elite universities because failing meant facing Barbara's disappointment. She was the compliant golden child who never spoke out of turn. Haley stood up from her chair. She let go of Brendan's hand and faced our mother. Her hands were trembling, but her posture was rigid and resolute. "She didn't destroy it," Haley said. Her voice cut through Barbara's hysterical sobbing. "You did." Barbara froze, staring at her favored daughter in shock. "You never cared about what I wanted." Haley continued, the words tumbling out with years of repressed grief. "You never cared that Brendan's family offered to help us. You only cared about how this wedding would look on your social media pages. You used my marriage as a prop to impress women who do not even like you. You forged my sister's signature and risked her career just so you could keep buying expensive clothes you cannot afford." "Haley, please," Barbara whimpered, reaching out a hand. "Do not touch me," Haley snapped, stepping back. "The illusion is over, Mom. There is no Cape Cod wedding. There is no venue. The catering is gone, and I'm glad it is gone. I hated every single second of planning that circus." Haley reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of embossed, cream-colored envelopes. They were the save-the-date cards Barbara had ordered weeks ago. Haley dropped them onto the mahogany table. They scattered across the polished wood landing next to the voided vendor contracts. "Brendan and I are eloping next week," Haley announced. The trembling in her hands stopped. She looked stronger than I had ever seen her. "We are going to his family's cabin in the Berkshire Mountains. We are hiring a local officiant, and we are getting married in the woods." Barbara let out a wounded, devastating sob. "The Berkshires," she repeated as if the word itself was a physical blow. "You cannot elope in a cabin. What will I tell the guests? What will I wear?" "You are not telling anyone anything," Haley said, her tone dropping into a cold, unyielding register. "And you do not need to worry about an outfit. You are not invited." The pronouncement hit Barbara with the force of a freight train. She stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the sideboard to steady herself. The daughter she had molded and manipulated her entire life had just publicly severed the cord. Barbara looked at me, and then at Haley. She saw a unified front she could no longer divide and conquer. Her power was entirely extinguished. Thomas sat in the heavy silence that followed. He looked at his weeping wife and his two furious daughters. He saw the ashes of his legacy scattered across the dining table. He did not offer any excuses or beg for a reprieve. He understood the math. He knew the promissory note was the only barrier standing between him and a prison cell. My father reached out and picked up the metal pen. His hand hovered over the signature line. He looked at me one last time. There was no anger in his expression, only a profound, hollow resignation. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his full legal name on the repayment agreement. He flipped to the second page and signed the liability transfer authorizing the liquidation of the Lexington Country Club equity. He set the pen down. The ink was dark and permanent. I collected the documents, checking the signatures for accuracy. I placed the papers back into my leather briefcase and locked the brass clasps. The transaction was complete. The $12,000 debt was legally bound to my parents. The trust funds were scheduled for repayment. My CPA license was shielded from the bank audit. I turned away from the table. I did not say goodbye. I walked out of the dining room, leaving my parents standing in the ruins of their own deception. The facade of the perfect Massachusetts family was permanently dismantled by the very paperwork they had tried to exploit. 6 months is a long time in the corporate financial sector. It provides enough runway for the slow, grinding wheels of bureaucracy to turn and deliver a final verdict. The regional bank in the Berkshire Mountains concluded their compliance audit right as the Boston snow began to melt into spring. The process required multiple tense meetings and endless document submissions. I provided the compliance officers with the signed promissory note alongside the liability transfer agreements my father executed in our dining room. The paperwork functioned exactly as my litigator intended. It established a clear documented trail proving I was the primary creditor and an unwitting victim of the initial forgery. Because I proactively managed the debt and reported the unauthorized disbursement through proper civil channels, the bank cleared my name. They closed the audit without referring the case to federal prosecutors. The fraud alert never touched my Social Security number. In late April, the senior partners at my accounting firm finalized their background evaluations. My credit profile remained pristine. I sat in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the bustling Boston Harbor and signed the partnership equity agreement. I earned the promotion I had sacrificed my entire 20s to secure. The senior partners shook my hand, welcoming me into the upper echelon of the firm. It was a professional triumph. Yet walking back to my corner office carrying the signed contract, I did not feel the urge to celebrate or host a lavish dinner. I just felt a lingering, profound exhaustion. The legal timeline caught up with my parents in a much harsher, unyielding fashion. They avoided a federal wire fraud indictment because I withheld the police report, but they could not escape the Internal Revenue Service. A generation-skipping transfer trust carries highly specific tax protections and rigid distribution rules. Unlawfully liquidating a high-value asset from that protected account triggered a severe early withdrawal penalty. Since my parents assumed the debt on paper to avoid criminal charges, the IRS assigned the tax liability directly to them. The federal government does not negotiate cancellation fees over the phone. They assess the penalty, add the accrued interest, and demand payment. My father had to face the stark reality of a working-class existence he had avoided for decades. The corporate severance was long gone. The gold retirement watch was pawned. He needed steady, reliable income to meet the rigid amortization schedule I drafted for the stolen trust funds and to pay off the mounting federal tax debt. Thomas took a job working the cash register at a local hardware store a few miles down the street from their house. He traded his tailored executive suits for a red canvas apron and sensible walking shoes. He spends his days ringing up bags of potting soil, cutting keys, and mixing paint for local contractors. Sometimes I drive past the store on my way to visit clients in the suburbs. I see him through the large storefront window standing behind the counter. He looks older now. His shoulders are permanently stooped under the weight of his own choices. The arrogance of his former executive life is entirely gone, replaced by the humbling physical toll of retail labor. On the first Friday of every single month, a direct deposit hits my checking account. The amount is exact to the penny. It is a slow, painful restitution, but he is paying the debt. He honors the ledger. Barbara faced a different kind of reckoning. The financial penalties and the looming IRS debt forced her to liquidate her prized equity share in the Lexington Country Club. The board of directors processed her resignation quietly, per their standard bylaws. But in a town like Lexington, quiet resignations generate the loudest gossip. Her sudden departure from the social committees and the summer gala planning boards signaled undeniable ruin to every affluent woman she had spent her life trying to impress. Without the country club, Barbara lost her entire social ecosystem. The glossy armor she wore to protect her fragile ego was stripped away. The mounting debt required her to find immediate employment. A woman in her late 50s with no recent work history and a ruined credit score does not secure an executive position. Barbara had to accept a job as a front desk receptionist at a boutique high-end real estate agency in the center of town. It is the exact agency that sells multi-million-dollar historic properties to the wealthy families she used to host for dinner. Her new reality is a bitter daily pill. She sits behind a sleek marble reception desk answering phone calls and managing the showing schedule for junior brokers. When the wealthy wives of Lexington walk into the office looking to buy investment properties or downsize their estates, Barbara is the employee required to stand up, greet them, and offer them a beverage. The woman who stole her daughter's identity just to serve imported seafood and maintain an illusion of grandeur now spends her afternoons fetching coffee for the exact same social circle she ruined her family to impress. The poetic justice is sharp and unforgiving. She is forced to wear a name tag and smile politely at women who used to treat her as an equal, but now view her as the hired help. She is a captive spectator in the world she tried to buy her way into. Every time she pours a cup of coffee for a former country club peer, she is reminded of the lie that brought her down. People often assume that executing a successful counter-strategy against toxic relatives brings a sense of joyful vindication. They expect a cinematic ending where the protagonist rides off into the sunset, feeling light and victorious. The reality of outsmarting your own parents is far more somber. The victory is undeniable. I protected my career, secured my financial future, and saved my sister from a disastrous marriage arrangement based on toxic pride. But the success carries a heavy, quiet sorrow. The relationship with my parents is permanently fractured. We do not speak. There are no holiday dinners, no casual weekend phone calls, and no shared celebrations. The silence stretching between Boston and Lexington is a necessary boundary, but it still aches. I had to accept the harsh, undeniable truth that the people who raised me were never the protectors I thought they were. They were deeply flawed individuals, willing to sacrifice their own children to preserve their comfort and their public image. Acknowledging that truth requires a specific kind of grieving. As an accountant, I fix broken ledgers and balance disparate accounts. I know how to make the math work. But a family is not a spreadsheet. You can force someone to repay a stolen trust fund down to the final decimal point, but you cannot force them to be the parents you needed. You cannot audit your way back to a healthy childhood. I mourn the parents I deserved while fiercely protecting myself from the parents I actually received. The dust from the confrontation has finally settled, leaving a clear, unobstructed view of the future. And that future belongs entirely to me and to the sister who finally learned how to walk away. The drive into the Berkshire Mountains takes about 2.5 hours from the Boston city limits. You leave the heavy traffic and the towering glass facades behind, exchanging them for winding 2-lane roads lined with dense evergreen forests. It is a quiet, rugged part of New England. It does not boast the polished coastal vanity of the Cape or the manicured perfection of a country club. It is just rock and timber and cold, fresh air. I navigated my sedan up a steep gravel driveway, listening to the tires crunch over loose stone. I was not handing my keys to a valet wearing a crisp white shirt. I parked next to an old, rusted pickup truck and turned off the engine. Brendan's family cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a deep valley. The structure was built from dark, stained logs, featuring a wraparound wooden deck and a stone chimney. It was modest and sturdy. This was the authentic version of the wealth my mother had spent her life pretending to understand. James and Catherine were already on the porch. They were not wearing tailored suits or designer silk dresses. James wore a faded fleece pullover, and Catherine had on scuffed leather hiking boots. They greeted me with warm, genuine smiles. There was no performative hosting, no forced laughter, and no catering staff circulating with silver trays. It was just a quiet family gathering in the woods. I walked inside and found Haley in the small guest bedroom. She was looking into a simple framed mirror hanging on the wooden wall. She did not look like the anxious weeping girl who had collapsed in my Somerville apartment. She did not resemble the rigid, terrified bride sitting at the Lexington dining table. She looked radiant. She had returned the custom designer gown weeks ago, using the refund to pay her first month's rent in her new apartment. Instead, she wore a simple ivory slip dress she bought off the rack at a local boutique. Her hair was pulled back loosely without the aid of an expensive styling team. I stood in the doorway holding a small bouquet of white wildflowers I had purchased from a roadside farm stand on the drive up. I tied the stems together with a piece of rough twine. I handed them to my sister. She took the flowers and let out a long, steady breath. For 27 years, she had worn the suffocating crown of the favored child. She had starved herself, studied until she broke, and performed on command to satisfy an audience that only cared about the glossy photographs. Today there were no photographers, there were no floral arches, there was no stage. The crushing weight of Barbara's image was finally gone. We stepped out onto the back deck. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine branches, casting long, golden shadows across the wooden planks. Brendan stood near the railing waiting for her. A local justice of the peace, a kind older man wearing a thick woolen sweater, stood ready with a leather-bound journal. I took my place a few steps behind my sister, acting as her maid of honor. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. It was quiet and honest. There was no grand orchestra playing a processional march. The only soundtrack was the wind moving through the trees and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. When Haley and Brendan exchanged their vows, they spoke softly to each other. They did not project their voices for the benefit of distant relatives sitting in the back row. They promised to support one another through hardship and build a life rooted in mutual respect. Listening to their words, I realized how dangerously close we had come to losing this moment. If I had yielded to my mother in the butler's pantry, or if I had allowed my father's tears to soften my legal boundaries, this authentic display of love would have been buried under a mountain of federal debt and forged ink. The $80,000 illusion would have consumed their future. After the justice of the peace pronounced them married, James walked inside the cabin and returned carrying a single bottle of inexpensive Prosecco. Catherine handed out clear plastic cups. We gathered around the wooden railing looking out over the valley. Brendan popped the cork, and the sound echoed into the trees. He poured the sparkling wine into the cheap plastic cups. We raised them into the air. The rim of my cup did not make a crisp, delicate clink when it touched Haley's. It made a dull, muted sound. But the wine tasted infinitely better than the vintage champagne my mother had served at the Seaport Grill. It tasted like freedom because it was paid for with honest money. Standing on that deck holding my plastic cup, I experienced a profound sense of geographical irony. A few miles down the winding mountain road sits the regional bank branch that originated the fraudulent home equity line of credit. When I drove up here, I actually passed the brick building where the underwriting officers processed my forged signature. My mother had targeted this remote banking institution, hoping the distance from Boston would conceal her theft. She used the Berkshire Mountains to construct her financial cage. Yet here we were standing in the exact same mountain range celebrating our liberation. The territory she chose for her crime had become the foundation of our escape. I looked at my sister laughing with her new husband. Her joy was unfiltered and real. The eating disorders, the panic attacks, the constant fear of inadequacy, all the toxic symptoms of our childhood seemed to wash away in the cool mountain breeze. I took a sip of the Prosecco and reflected on the long, brutal journey that brought us to this wooden deck. When toxic family dynamics reach a boiling point, the instinct is often to fight fire with fire. The urge to scream, throw objects, or orchestrate a dramatic revenge plot is a strong biological pull. Our culture conditions us to believe that loud, chaotic confrontations are the only way to resolve a deep betrayal. But chaos is the exact environment where manipulators thrive. People like Barbara and Thomas rely on emotional turbulence to obscure the facts. They use guilt tears and historical grievances to distract you from the ledger. I did not win this war by raising my voice. I won by refusing to participate in their emotional theater. I utilized standard tax codes. I established firm legal boundaries. I drafted promissory notes and liability transfers. I confronted painful financial truths without blinking. I fought paper with paper, and I let the mathematical reality dismantle the illusion. There is a pervasive social expectation in our culture that demands relentless loyalty to your blood relatives regardless of the cost. We are taught to forgive financial abuse and overlook emotional manipulation simply because the perpetrator shares our last name. That ideology is a trap designed to keep the victims compliant. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a toxic family member is to legally dismantle their delusions. You stop enabling their destructive behavior. You force them to face the stark, unyielding consequences of their actions. You close the accounts and lock the doors. It is not an act of malice. It is an act of extreme necessary preservation. I watched the sun dip below the tree line, casting a cool twilight over the valley. The air grew sharp and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The ledger was finally balanced. The debt was contained. The partnership at my accounting firm was secure. My sister was safe. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, enduring peace. The cost of this peace was high, but it was worth every single calculated step. If you ever find yourself sitting across from someone who demands you sacrifice your future to finance their pride, remember the power of a quiet boundary. Do not let guilt manipulate your signature. Do not let the fear of a public scene stop you from verifying the numbers. Protect your peace, protect your credit score, and always read the paperwork. We are all architects quietly constructing the invisible houses in which our families will live. In modern American culture, where the pursuit of success is woven into our very DNA, the blueprints for these invisible houses are rarely drawn from the soul. Instead, they are handed to us by society. We are told that a successful family requires a pristine lawn, a prestigious zip code, children with acceptance letters to elite universities and weddings that look like they belong in the glossy pages of a magazine. But from the perspective of a spiritual practitioner, we must ask a devastating question. What happens when the foundation of that house is made of ego rather than truth? The story of Layla Haley and their parents is far more than a tale of financial fraud and canceled caterers. It serves as a profound modern allegory. It reflects a deep spiritual sickness prevalent in aspects of modern American society, the idolization of the ego, the attachment to external validation, and the generational trauma inflicted when parents use their children to soothe their own internal wounds. If we look closely at Barbara's tragic downfall, we realize it was not ultimately caused by a lack of money. It was caused by a profound spiritual bankruptcy. In our culture, it is dangerously easy to confuse our net worth, our neighborhood, and our social standing with our inherent human worth. When parents attach their identity to these external markers, they fall into the ancient trap of illusion, often referred to in spiritual traditions as Maya. As parents, we must cultivate the wisdom to recognize that a child is not a billboard for our success. They are not a second chance at our failed dreams, nor are they a shield against our social insecurities. When Barbara forced Haley to wear the heavy crown of the golden child, pushing her toward elite universities and demanding a lavish performative wedding, she was not nurturing her daughter's soul. She was feeding her own ego. True spiritual wisdom requires parents to radically detach their self-worth from their children's external achievements. A child's purpose on this earth is to discover their authentic self, not to manage their parents' public image. This spiritual sickness also claims the fathers of our society. Thomas's quiet, weeping collapse on the docks reveals a devastating truth about modern manhood and the American obsession with being a provider within the traditional family structure. When Thomas lost his corporate job, he felt he lost his very right to exist. Out of pure shame, he compromised his moral compass, actively participating in a massive fraud simply to maintain an illusion. But true morality is not defined by the ability to write a large check. Morality is defined by the courage to stand in your truth, especially when your hands are completely empty. Parents must cultivate the moral fortitude to be honest with their families about their failures, their fears, and their financial realities. Hiding your struggles breeds deceit, and deceit rots the family foundation from the inside out. We must teach our children morality by showing them that it is entirely acceptable to start over, to downsize, and to be financially vulnerable so long as we remain honest. True dignity is found in integrity, not in a country club membership. Before we explore how to break these toxic cycles, I want to invite you to join our community. If stories that explore the hidden depths of human relationships, the resilience of the spirit, and the hard, necessary truths of family life resonate with you, please take a moment to subscribe to Sofia Told Stories. We are dedicated to sharing narratives that challenge, heal, and reflect the realities of our lives, and we would be deeply honored to have you walk this journey with us. Breaking the cycle of generational trauma requires what spiritual practitioners call fierce compassion, and Layla's response to her parents' betrayal is a masterclass in this concept. Society often conditions us to believe that family loyalty means endless self-sacrifice. We are told to absorb toxic behavior, to keep the peace, and to enable our family's delusions under the guise of forgiveness. But true love does not mean allowing yourself to be destroyed. Layla did not scream, she did not seek petty, chaotic revenge, but she also absolutely refused to absorb the karma of her parents' bad choices. She cultivated resilience by understanding that setting firm, unyielding boundaries is often the most loving thing you can do for a spiritually sick family member. By legally dismantling her parents' delusion using tax codes and promissory notes, Layla stopped them from accumulating more karmic and financial debt. Parents must learn and in turn teach their children that true unconditional love sometimes looks like a firm, unwavering no. We must empower our children to protect their peace, their energy, and their futures, even if the threat to those things comes from within their own home. Emotional awareness means recognizing when helping someone is actually just helping them drown. When we finally strip away the illusions, we are left with the choice of how we want to live. The contrast between the $80,000 Cape Cod spectacle and the quiet, inexpensive elopement in the Berkshire Mountains is deeply symbolic. The Cape Cod wedding represented the ego-loud, expensive, performative, and entirely fake. The Berkshire cabin represented the authentic, soul-grounded quiet, deeply connected to nature, and rooted in undeniable truth. Our greatest spiritual duty as parents is to guide our families back to authenticity. Society will constantly try to sell you the idea that more is better, more prestige, more luxury, more visibility. But the most profound joys in life are completely free of the need for an audience. We must strive to create homes where our children feel safe to be ordinary, safe to be imperfect, and safe to choose a quiet life in the woods over a performative life on a glittering stage. The ultimate takeaway for American parents is both a challenge and a liberation. Heal your own wounds so your children do not have to carry them. Do not ask your children to finance your unfulfilled ambitions either emotionally or literally. Cultivate a life rooted in absolute truth, no matter how modest or unglamorous that truth may be. When you finally strip away the designer labels, the elite degrees, and the exhausting social posturing, what remains is the only thing that actually matters, the honest, unconditional connection between souls. We are all building invisible houses. Some are made of marble and lies. Others are made of simple wood and truth. The paperwork of our lives, our choices, our boundaries, our spoken fears will always eventually reveal the integrity of our foundation. You have to wonder when the applause finally fades and the lights go out in the empty rooms we fought so desperately to decorate, who will be left sitting in the dark with us? Will it be a family held together by authentic love or strangers bound by an invoice? And more importantly, when we strip away every title society has given us and look into the mirror, will we even recognize the face staring back?